Welcome to another infographic instant with Brian Michael. In this episode, we'll be looking at whether Asia's lax shadow banking regulations give it a competitive advantage. In general, we've been talking about substitutability and complementarity in shadow banking. We've been looking at the extent to which shadow banking helps or hinders the development of different financial sectors across the world. And in those infographics, we haven't taken the cross-border dimension into account. Namely, one of the most salient features of shadow banking is that a lot of the securitization and the selling of these loans happens across borders. Thus, national regulations, determine the competitiveness of any particular jurisdiction in offering shadow banking services. With this in mind, let us turn our attention to the infographic in order to see where compliance costs are relatively low and decreasing over time. The infographic shows a percent of compliance officers spending more than 10 hours a week tracking regulatory developments. And the bar charts show the change in this percent of compliance officers from 2012 to 2013. So looking at the UK, for example, we see that this percent has increased by about 5% of compliance officers in that year. That suggests that UK compliance officers have an increasing regulatory burden related in general to financial regulation, but of course dealing with provisions that touch upon shadow banking as well. Ironically, one of the hardest hit jurisdictions, particularly in terms of shadow banking, has seen a decrease in the percent of compliance officers spending this large amount of time tracking regulatory developments. The change is most noticeable in Asia, where we see that, albeit from a relatively high base, that the percent of compliance officers spending this large amount of time has fallen almost 10%. And we see a similar change in the Middle East, albeit from a much lower base. The rest of the world, for all intents and purposes, remains relatively unchanged. So stepping back, what these data suggest are that the UK has become less competitive in terms of providing a regulatory environment which fosters cross-border shadow banking. The US has become slightly more competitive, but it's Asia and the Middle East which seem at first glance almost to be adopting beggar thy neighbor policies by having relatively lax financial regulatory environments which also touch upon shadow banking. And this could encourage the attraction of portfolio flows into these economies, thereby, of course, making their asset managers richer. We will have to see over time the extent to which these compliance costs actually translate into financial flows. However, as we have shown in the previous infographics, the data look promising to what we have called the emerging dozen. This has been another infographic instant with Brian Michael.